I'm Michael Welch. This is Dr. John Koch. John is a retired medical doctor, an OB/GYN to be exact, who's had a lifelong interest, as you might imagine, in biology. Somewhere early in your career, John, you discovered, the enlightenment came that biology was not symbolized and the other sciences were symbolized, such as chemistry and physics and of course math and other things in our lives like music. And you've worked for years to develop a system of symbolization in biology that I find fascinating, and that's what this conversation is really about, to be introduced to your symbolism of biology and explain the basic part of it to me, if you would, and how it will be useful for the universe to understand this. Let's start with the symbols, John, if we could, and your reason for doing them. They're very simple. There's a loop, which is an interior sign, and there's a wave, which is an environmental or an exterior symbol.
Yeah. Let me explain how the symbols started. I personally felt that we have some inner world that has its own activity, like digestion, like breathing, like physiological activities that we have internally that are automatic to the cellular interactive process. And then we have some consciousness that we could partially, only slightly regulate the activity by intentionally exercising and meditating or whatever we're doing. It influences the relationship and the abstract aspect of life. So there are two, my symbols are only two symbols, like computer 0 and 1. We have loop represents information energy within biological system. So if you're talking about single cell, the loop, there are many different loops inside of a cell represent the abstract information and energy that regulates chemistry and physical activities of that cell.
Within a living organism.
This is within inner world of the living organism.
Okay.
This is environmental factors, is a wave, environmental factors that influences this energy, the internal inner world energy and information.
Influenced by the exterior.
Right.
And
external world influences the inner world.
You've come up with these three potentials within the living organism. Would you explain those? You call it CAS?
To simplify the complexity of loop and wave, there are subdivision of the need. The loop represents the need of the inner world. One is CAS, which is the chemicals, chemicals because there's oxygen and food and water. Specifically, we need chemicals that the cells need chemical to live,
to function,
to function, to live. And there's a chemical aspect of loop. There is the adaptive process that continuously have to adapt to psychologically, emotionally, to the dynamically changing environmental factors that influences them. The other third one is the synergy needs. These are minimal need survival kit of the organism that they need these three in order to live. So these are the abstract aspect of life of a cell or bacteria or
so
virus.
Then the chemical combined with the adaptive then becomes synergetic, it becomes greater?
Not really. CAS, the chemical, the adaptive process, and synergy are the really united whole. And every change in chemistry, what we eat, it influences the adaptive process. Adaptive process, what we try to adapt, influences the chemicals and influences the synergy. So there are three united things, but we have to separate them in order to understand them. That's the purpose of separation.
All right. Well, now let's go to this page, which is demonstrating some of the chemical substances involved, some of the chemistry involved with the caste system, and this is the, well, I'll let you explain this, please.
There's a list of the list of chemicals that we need that include the fat and carbohydrate and protein, and I guess bacteria are necessary for survival.
Absolutely.
And all the environmental factors that we utilize for, we call them chemicals, and adaptive process, which is relates to organization. The abstract aspect of life, the mind and plasticity of the psychological aspect of life, and so the other is the synergy that relates to primarily how adaptation happens to the environmental variables. So the religion and faith and belief and culture and institutions where we are, who a human being is, influences the decision that we make, what or behavior that bodily make for survival.
Okay. All right. So these symbols include all of this.
Symbols includes, that's right.
All right. So here we have the basic symbols, and I see these are colored. The loop is colored to designate what it represents.
Right. To illustrate the caste potentials, the chemical, the adaptive process, and the synergy. To illustrate them, I had to give them color. So color of the loop, red represents chemical, black loop represents adaptive process, and blue represents synergy, the potentials that is needed in caste potential as it interacts with the environmental factors.
Okay, I understand.
And environment is a green loop.
Environment's always green.
Environment is always green because the outside world there are really many different types of environmental factors.
But not a loop, a wave.
With a wave, once it affects the human being, becomes electrochemical. It doesn't matter what kind of environmental factor it is. There's only one type of influence, effect it has in my five senses that I have that enters my body in terms of one thing, electrochemical. This abstract electrochemical, which wave represents. Wave represents that.
So electromagnetism, the universal force.
That's right. Electromagnetism is omnipresent, is everywhere, inside of a cell, outside of a cell. I have put the bio in front of all the biological factors that influences human being. So we know that atomic world, the salt, suppose we can die from lack of salt, and it influences the body. So the sodium and calcium that makes the salt, I call it bioatom. And then biomolecule is the salt itself, because inside of the body has biological properties, but is outside on the kitchen table, it has different types of properties.
Got it. So when it's internalized by any kind of a living thing, a bacteria to a human, to an elephant, it becomes bio.
It becomes bio.
Got it.
That
Very
really
simple.
simplify the complexity that we have had with the biological system.
All right, this is all starting to make sense. So now when we combine the colors, we can see what is happening. Here's a chemical, here's a potential, here's a
Synergy.
synergy.
It's the interaction. This represents a single interaction in a body. Single interaction is hard to isolate in the human body because of the network of relationship between many interactions all at the same time. But if we want to show it, illustrate a single interaction, like a breath, you take oxygen in, it goes into the inner world, supplies oxygen and energy for all the cells, and then out. this is one interaction in the human term, and so that shows a single interaction between inner world and outer world. A breath that I take in and exhale of the waste product.
Got it.
So we have a CAS, and this has to be internalized. The oxygen that enters the CAS system inside of the human body, it has to be internalized. That also is shown.
When it's combined, yes. And then, now, what's this complicated looking mess?
Right, this is the multiple interactions behind the network of relationship and pattern of relationship that is formed inside of a cell, outside of a cell, between 70 trillion cells that we have. And you can see on this multiple CAS, multiple chemical, multiple adaptive process, multiple synergistic loop, and this is the same thing except that environmental factors that enters
The wave has entered.
the wave that enters is broken down to pieces to internalize, to become part of this system, to be utilized physiologically using the energy for survival.
Now, how would, all right, I'm really starting to understand this. How would this be utilized in demonstrating the interaction of the body? Let's say the brain, for instance. The brain has become, here's a slide of a brain. This is the year of the brain. Everybody's talking about the brain. With your system of symbolization, does this demonstrate the interaction in the brain of the CAS and the CAS potential and the environmental factors?
Yes, this model will show but will illustrate symbolically the growth and development of the brain from womb to tomb to catacomb.
Oh,
from
I like that.
From single cell that we're all made of.
Yes.
Where is the brain in there? There's only instructions and information and potential inside of that single cell that become 2 and 4 and the stem cells that they all go toward specialization toward the brain and heart and liver. So that instruction is within DNA of every cell in the human body from beginning to the end. So the brain that is formed, that it takes several sessions really to go through it, but the brain that is formed, that shows the pattern of the CAS potentials in the brain, the chemical, adaptive, and synergy potentials within the brain. And if the child is exposed to the brain, the more exposure to the environmental factor, more internalization of the environmental factor, more complex, crowded network is within.
The child then that's deprived in the youth, as some of the orphans were in Ceausescu's world in Romania.
That's right.
Their brains don't look like this.
No, that's right. We are not born with performances. We conceive, and we were born with potentials. It has to have environment that evokes the potentials from that organism, whatever organism is, and it takes environment to do it. And if you put a piano in front of the child and encourage them to learn, so they develop the CAS potential for the piano, which relates to entire brain. It's not only one area, but it crowds the area or very organized to certain area of the brain that could be illustrated.
Develops more connections.
More connections and more hubs or CAS potentials.
And this would also be true for the other organs in the body that you mentioned, the liver and the lungs and the...
Exactly, for all biology, even worms and amoeba and bacteria, they have their own potentials and their own environment that has to evoke the potential to form their own pattern of CAS relationship.
So when my niece eats the worm in the garden, you'll be able to illustrate the effect of the worm on her little beautiful system.
Yes, the illustration is it's longitudinal and horizontal, and it's three-dimensional. I have made the three-dimensional dynamic integrative model of the CAS potential inside of the human brain.
I think it's fascinating. Let's stay with this for a second. We will save this because the object of this conversation is for you to explain this to me. If I can understand it, hopefully the rest of the world will be able to understand it. And one of the reasons I know that you were interested in this is there's so many branches of science now, and there's so many people who become so focused on their own branch that they miss a whole lot of the rest of things that are going on that interplay, that interconnect with what they're doing. If you can create a universal language such as music, where people who speak Russian understand the same musical scales as people who speak English.
Universal symbolic information model is everywhere.
And then all these different branches of science could just look at a picture of the body with the symbols in place.
And the symbols unifies the sciences.
Of course.
The mind and the brain that unifies everything. So you look at the science as not an isolated field, but part of the much larger, huge world of science.
Exactly.
It's everything could be scientific, is natural, and should be explained, and should be able to draw and illustrate what is health, what is diseases, what is inside of the human, inside of the brain. We're talking about brain.
The purpose of science, as far as I'm concerned, is to understand things.
That's right.
Biology, the universe.
But without the symbol, understanding...
The symbols make it much easier.
Dynamically moving, changing things are not easy to describe to the next generation, from one generation. You know, if you try to teach children music without symbols, progress would be extremely slow.
Very slow.
The next generation will not be able to have Mozart's and other science musician. The same thing for alphabet or any other language.
Yeah, that's right. I think this is fascinating, John, and I appreciate this conversation, and I understand a whole lot more about this than I did before.
I have about, within 34 years, I have about 300-400 steps from bioatom, how the information and energy from bioatom is transferred to molecules, to cells, to tissue, to organ, to human, to societies, the layers of human organization, the network of relationship between these could be illustrated. That is what we want. We want to see networks. That the world, most universities now, they're teaching multidisciplinary approach, really toward technology and computer and everything else. The beauty part of this is that it's a binary. It could be computerized. It could be structurally made, and for children to understand for future. What is health? What is disease? What's mind and body? How genetic environmental factors really influence each other? What's epigenetic? What is all these issues that we are dealing with could be illustrated.
I think this may turn out to be a long conversation, which I'm looking forward to.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
That's
Real pleasure, John. Thank you.